to make him look crazy and then hit him hard on that, not on any substance. Why did they do that? Because Donald Trump was based. And his comments on NATO, I'm revisiting his comments on NATO, and he was absolutely right. I'm going to go through those comments. He made a comment here. While on the campaign trail in 2016, Trump made clear that he saw NATO as a relic of the Cold War. You know, we're dealing with NATO from the days of the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. We need to either transition into terror, and what he means is combating terrorism, or we need something else. And then this is from a German publication, so it's a very biased, corporate leftist publication that I'm getting this from. So their editorial, the editorial piece of this is they're saying Trump's remarks didn't account for how the alliance backed the U.S. well after the collapse of the Soviet Union, especially in Afghanistan, as if Afghanistan wasn't a disaster. That's not a strong editorial comment there. And this is from the Deutsche Welle, I should know, Deutsche Welle publication is where I took this from. So tell me where the lie is. NATO is a relic of the Cold War. Where's the lie? We're dealing with the days of the Soviet Union, which no longer exists. There's no lie there. I didn't like the we need to either transition to terror. I'm not fond of that part of it. But he said, or we need something else. He was just open-minded. Yeah, that made perfect sense. Germany owes vast sums. This is one of the most famous points that Trump made, and they tried to make him look like some type of idiot or a clown. You know what? That stuff just gets on my nerves. And when now Biden's in office, he's going to have a State of the Union address coming up next Tuesday, and no one defends him on substance. They attack Trump on anything but substance. They try to make him look like a buffoon, which he was like when his handling of the pandemic early on and pretty much all the way until the spring and summer was buffoonery. It was bad, but they tried to make everything look bad. And they tried to make his handling of the pandemic look worse than it was. It was already bad. And then they tried to make it look worse. Here's what, before I do this, I just want Biden supporters, I want you to back Biden on substance.
I can tell y'all why I support Trump. Tell me why y'all support this motherfucker. Ain't doing shit but fucking us up every day, fucking us up.
I hope that's not too much to ask. Just tell me why. But Germany owes vast sums. Worded awkward, it was awkwardly worded. But here's what this, Trump said. Trump has made defense spending his main talking point on NATO. And was that his main? It was the one that the media blew up. I think his main point was the previous point, but the media just didn't blow it up. This was the one they tried to blow up as, oh, he doesn't understand foreign affairs. But he has falsely accused member states of owing money to Washington, saying Germany owes vast sums of money to NATO, and the United States must be paid more for the powerful and very expensive defense it provides to Germany. The problem is NATO doesn't work like that. No money is owed to the alliance for defense or otherwise. Perfect example of how they take his statement where he has a clear based point. They know he has a based point, but he worded it as, and I'm very familiar with this because I make mistakes like this too. He said Germany owes vast sums. That's not a part of the NATO agreement. There's no like bank account and you run up debt with NATO. But that doesn't mean that they're not putting in what they should be putting in. He was absolutely based. This is a Reuters, before we had fact checks, they probably would have called it a fact check. But Reuters made this comment in response to, this article in response to Trump. And so in this article, the German defense minister, Ursula von der Leyen, on Sunday rejected Trump's comment that NATO owes money. There is no debt account. You see how they're talking about there's no debt. We don't owe you because there's no debt. They didn't say we have been paying what we should have been paying. They just said, hey, so it's possible that they couldn't have been paying what they should have been paying into NATO, but we're not counting debt. So he's false. But does he have a point, though? That's those two different things. They're trying to play games. So they said, adding it was wrong to link the alliance target for members to spend 2%. So NATO has this agreement. You spend 2% of their economic output. I think it's GDP. I don't know why they're using, maybe it's a different metric, but 2% of their economic output on defense by 2024 solely to NATO. What they're saying is, oh, no. It wasn't just solely to NATO. Defense spending also goes into UN peacekeeping missions. What the hell does that have to do with NATO? Into our European missions and into our contribution to the fight against terrorism. She said everyone wanted the burden to be shared fairly, and for that to happen, it has to have a modern security concept. You see how they take Trump? So basically, they're saying Trump has a point. It's just that, okay, let's count this other spending in there too. No. That's not what we're talking about. Direct spending into the defense of NATO. I'm going to get to why Trump called NATO obsolete. German defense spending is set to rise by 1.4 billion. This is back in 2018, a figure that is projected to represent 1.26% of economic output. So we're not at the 2%. In 2016, Germany's defense spending ratio stood at 1.18. That's a weird article. That's a weird way to say Trump was right. That's really weird. Why didn't they just say Trump was right? Because they don't want to have these type of discussions. During her trip to Washington, at the time, Merkel reiterated Germany's commitment to the 2% military spending goal. They wrote probably 500 plus words just to say Trump had a point. He called it obsolete. This is very pertinent to where we are now. Days before his inauguration, Trump caught NATO members off guard. So he was very unpredictable. It would be almost like having a private citizen. He was a private citizen, just a random private citizen become president and start looking at what's happening and saying, none of this stuff makes sense. And then all the people that don't want the quiet part out loud start saying, no, he's an idiot. He's the orange man. He's racist. He's that. So they can discredit him. And behind the curtain, there's like, shh, you're not supposed to say this stuff out loud. He said the alliance was obsolete and threatened to withdraw support. Quote, I said a long time ago that NATO had bad problems. Number one, it was obsolete because it was designed many, many years ago. Months later, he retracted his statement, citing changes within the alliance. Now they fight terrorism. So Trump, that's the swamp. That's the quicksand of the swamp engulfing Trump there a little bit for him to try to backpedal. And I'm not going to, that's wrong of him, in my opinion, to be talking about this fake war on terrorism, in my opinion. But it's the swamp. Like, it's easy for me to say where I'm hunkered in my basement that I'm not going to be engulfed by the swamp. So they did force Trump to retract a little bit on that, but he was absolutely based. Of course it's obsolete. I'm going to get into that more detail. Let me finish this one off here. Doesn't sound very smart. Trump had tended to lump trade between U.S. allies and how much Washington spends on defense. We're spending a fortune on military in order to lose $800 billion in trade losses. That doesn't sound very smart to me, Trump said. The problem is that while NATO members have agreed to spend 2% of their GDP on defense, the alliance has nothing to do with international trade. We know the alliance doesn't have anything to do with international trade, but the money we're spending or losing has to do with us, America. I don't even understand what the retort on that is. Trump's just like, we're spending all this money on the NATO defense. It's obsolete. Do we even need to be doing it? And on top of that, we're losing money on trade. The base point. Then now, this was a comment he said back then, years ago. Congratulations, you're in World War III. In an interview with Fox News, Trump was asked why the U.S. should jump to the defense of NATO allies, Montenegro, if it was attacked. The president said he asked himself the same question, a remark that appeared to undermine the alliance's collective defense clause. Trump went on to describe Montenegrins as very strong and very aggressive, and that aggression risked starting World War III. He basically predicted what's happening now, back then. Just Trump, stupid old Trump. also said, "We are the schmucks." During a 2018 rally in Montana, Trump hit out at the European allies, saying they want us to protect against Russia, and yet they pay billions of dollars to Russia, and we're the schmucks paying for the whole thing. Trump was referring to Russia as Europe's primary source for oil and natural gas, but he created a false dichotomy between energy reliance and NATO's defense spending goal. What's the false dichotomy? Let's get into that a little bit more. He's talking about basically Nord Stream. This is Nord Stream 1. I went to the website of the developer. If you're not familiar, Nord Stream is piping basically for natural gas from Russia to the EU. So this started in 2000. They commissioned Nord Stream as a project to get energy across the area there from Russia to Europe. In April of 2010, it was launched, and then it was first put into service in 2011 and pretty much done by 2012. This is kind of what it looks like when they were constructing this thing. It's unbelievable technology and advancement to transfer resources. So people say, what's really happening in Russia and Ukraine? What I see is some people say, well, Putin wants to bring back the old Soviet Union. Some people say, well, he's worried about NATO pushing east. Some people say it's all about the natural gas. It can be about all three of those things. I mean, none of those three things are independent of each other. So who knows? Nobody knows unless you literally ask him. Even what he says, you don't, I mean, it could be lies. So nobody really knows why, but it could be all of those things. And this is in response to Russian actions in Ukraine. Germany is withholding its approval of major pipeline designed to move natural gas from Russia to Germany. This is the second. The first Nord Stream 1 was the one that went through Ukraine. This is 2 that is going to go around Ukraine, and it needs Germany's sign off to start operating for it. Europe is trying to transition away from coal and crude oil, but it still relies on Russian natural gas to supplement the wind and solar power. They've had struggles with this going green. They need a backup. If the solar panels get covered with snow, the wind turbines aren't moving because of the winter and snow, you've got to cover it. This is a person who is ahead of this SVB Energy International. It's in Washington, I believe. They said Russian gas is the cheapest and most available supply. This is going exactly back to this comment where Trump said, it's the comment where Trump was saying that we're schmucks. He was talking about they want us to protect against Russia, yet they pay billions of dollars to Russia. And he's talking about for the energy. This is what he's talking about right here. They try to make Trump look stupid. It's right here. This person who is Arkady Ostrovsky, this is the Economist, Russia and Eastern Europe editor. He made some comments here. They asked him about, let's talk about international pressure points in terms of energy and supply lines. He said, it's been a problem for very long, since the days of the Cold War Russia. So he said right now, or this is before Nord Stream 2, which is not active right now. It's done, it's built, but it's not active. He said Russia exports between 40 to 50% of the whole of Europe. So Europe is dependent on Russia for 40 to 50% of their natural gas. Germany in particular gets up to 75% of its natural gas through Russia. So you see what Trump's saying? Trump's like, why are we paying for you for defense against Russia, and you're getting 75% of your natural gas through Russia? That's before they build or they use the new Nord Stream 2. What kind of sense does that make? And you can see why Russia's doing it. It's not just about resources. People say, well, it just comes down to resources. Yeah, it does. But then it also comes down to how does Russia weaken the power of NATO? NATO is basically America. America's funding NATO. So when you see NATO countries on the border of Russia, you basically just need to picture the United States at the border of Russia. because if one bullet shell hits the foot of the wrong person, we're all in war, and that's America. So Russia's like, how do we weaken NATO without firing a bullet? This is how we do it. We get money, we supply them with the natural gas, they give us, so we get revenue from that, and they're dependent on us. So if anything goes down, Europe will stay independent because they're like, we don't want to be in the cold. Russia could cut us off at any moment. So say something happened in another part of the world, and it's a proxy war between the US and Russia, not even a direct war, much less a direct war, which we're closer to now than ever or recently. If something happens, Germany is going to be like, even though they're in NATO, Germany's going to be like, my name's Bennett and I ain't in it. They're going to be like, don't look at me. Because if they go in and upset Russia, Russia would cut off their natural gas. So it's not just about resources, it's leverage against NATO. Russia leverage against NATO. And that's why I think our representatives can't make a clear case to the American public. They asked Jen Psaki the other day, this has as low as 26% in one poll support for any type of U.S. intervention here. And Jen Psaki was like, we decide what's important for the United States. They can't even explain why it's important because they would have to acknowledge NATO is obsolete. Trump was right. Our stranglehold with NATO is weakening. NATO is weakening. If they get resources from Russia, they're more culturally aligned with Russia in some ways. Many of those countries, not all of them, but Russia's like, hey, we're really a part of Europe now. And you could have NATO, but it won't have any sway over NATO countries if they're dependent on Russia. And nobody in the US government wants to really acknowledge that. Ted Cruz is the one that comes the closest to, but he never even goes that far to really spell it out. So all you're saying is Trump is right. Correct. It's not just Germany that's dependent on Russian gas. Russia's also dependent on the sale of their gas to Europe. So it goes both ways. Russia needs the revenue. But who do you think is more concerned? Because prices for energy in Europe has skyrocketed. It's gone up. So they don't want to have their citizens out in the cold or even have to pay more for gas prices. In this article, it was talking about how you can ship in natural gas through I forgot how it was done, but you have to pay for shipping. It's all expensive. So, and they're already at 100% of the capacity of doing that. So it's not like Americans can supplement this. It's much more cheaper because Russia's right there. This is a map of Nord Stream 2. Let me look at a map. This map is of Nord Stream 1. It's going to be hard to see. You can pause the video maybe. But right in the middle of the map, you'll see a number that says 140. I believe that's 140. I think that's billion cubic meters. So they're measuring the capacity of the pipeline. But where you see the 140, that is Ukraine. And that's where Nord Stream 1 goes through. So that Russia doesn't, and they're getting control of it now, but Russia didn't have control of that because Ukraine was basically a U.S. proxy. Even though Ukraine's not in NATO, the United States overthrew in 2014 the Ukraine president, forget who it was, who was pro-Russia. This is allegedly that the United States supported a movement to overthrow that and put in a more United States friendly government. So they're not in NATO, but they're United States friendly, and most all the other countries around them are in NATO. So Russia didn't have the control they wanted over Nord Stream 1 that went through Ukraine to Europe. This time, with Nord Stream 2, this goes straight through the Baltic Sea. They don't need to worry about Ukraine at all for Nord Stream 2. And that's why Ted Cruz under Trump put sanctions on the company that was making Nord Stream 2 to stop it. But it still got finished. I forgot when it got finished, but it's all done now. Biden got into office. He lifted the sanctions immediately. We still have not got an explanation as to why. Still to this day, Ted Cruz has been grilling all kinds of people in the administration when they have congressional hearings. We still have not got a reason why he lifted the sanctions. I believe there was some type of agreement, like, okay, we'll lift the sanctions, and then if Russia's aggressive, then we'll put them back. But it didn't. It's too late. It's too late. Russia's aggressive. They did put them back. I heard that yesterday, but it's too late. So they're not using this pipeline right now, and they're doing more sanctions on Russia. What does that all mean? Well, you look at Germany. This is from some type of German publication. I took this picture, and then I had to translate it to English. What it is a poll of Germans. They say they clearly are in favor of the completion and use of Nord Stream 2. 75% of Germans. So, polling, take it or leave it, but that does match. Germany wants to use it because it's cheaper. Of course, people want to use it. Imagine being in Germany and your heating bill is more than your rent. That's what we're looking at. And part of this, the part that people don't talk about, is this clean energy, which I'm all for clean energy, but it's not easy. So they went from like 6% of energy coming from turbines and solar panels to like 40% in 2000, which was a great increase. And a lot of people, because I'm into Tesla, a lot of people in the Tesla community be like, wow, look at Germany, look at how good they're doing. But now we're seeing the ramifications. They had problems in the winter, and they really still need natural gas. So now they're even more dependent on Russia. That's another part that a lot of people aren't talking about. And you can argue Biden has made decisions here with fracking, and I understand that. I'm all for taking care of nature. I'm very big on that. But we have to look at the ramifications. We can't just say, hey, let's stop this pipeline. Hey, let's stop this pipeline. Let's stop the fracking. And who cares what the consequences are? We have to be green. No, we have to have an honest conversation on that. We can't be more energy dependent. And one thing you can't say, under Trump, we were more energy independent than under Biden. So people will say Biden didn't, cause gas prices to go up directly. No, it's not all his fault. Inflation's not all his fault, but his policies aren't helping. And there is partly his fault. And this is an article where they were talking about the rising energy prices. So in the end, basically what Trump was saying, America funding the defense of NATO countries from Russia, yet these same countries want to get all their energy from Russia. That makes no sense. That's a waste. We're paying for that. Taxpayer money. It makes zero sense. I don't hear people like the Squad talking about it. Like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was talking about the Biden the child tax credit was expired. Well, then why don't we take some of this defense funding, say, forget about this. What is the point? What are we accomplishing with this or elsewhere? And then use it on that and work with the populace. The populist right would be perfectly fine with that. It makes zero sense. Trump was proven right yet again. Robert Gates, former Obama defense secretary, admitted on record, on video, that Trump got it right about China. He basically awakened all Americans. And Trump was right about NATO. Everything he said about NATO had a point to it. I'm not going to say it was 100% right because of his phrasing, but the point behind his phrasing was 100% right. And you wonder why they attack him, why they're going after him, because if he got into a situation where he had to decide about military conflict, and 26% of it was only supported by 26% of the country, he wouldn't do it. That's why. They can't control him. I know there have been talks about Trump's connection to, some of the most elite in the world. And is he a plant and all that? Could be. I don't know. But looking at his actions, the will of the people, and it ends up guiding him. And that's why they have to make him look like a buffoon and discredit him.